So, full confession, I wrote some of this sermon while I was watching the funeral of Pope Francis. Did anybody else watch the funeral? Some people. So if I break out into Latin kind of sporadically, then miserere. Have mercy on me. And that was quite good, wasn't it? Good little opening joke. There was something quite remarkable about this Pope's life, I think. Clearly, we're not a Catholic church, and we have some very different ideas. But we want to have the humility to learn from what God is doing in other parts of his church. And I think there's a lot to learn. From my perspective, his was a life that pointed powerfully towards the wideness of God's mercy. You know, another name for the Pope is the Pontifex, or the Pontiff, and the Pontiff actually means a bridge maker or a bridge builder. And in the first few weeks, actually, we've got a nice photo of bridge building, Haley. Sadly, they're not here today. I thought that would be quite nice. I saw that on Facebook yesterday. Stephen and Schutze on top of the Forth Road Bridge, rail bridge. Sorry, I knew I was getting it wrong. Yesterday, pretty cool. Anyway, in the first few weeks of this Pope's tenure, he was washing the feet of young offenders in a prison. Washing the feet of young offenders in a prison in Italy. A few weeks later, he was spending time with stateless refugees. Not only believers, not only Catholic believers. You know, this question, does God care about these people too? That's a question that the world is asking. You better believe God cares about those people too. You better believe God cares about young offenders in Italian prisons and stateless refugees scattered around the world. And so if Pope Francis, if part of his mission was trying to build a bridge from the forgotten people of the world towards the boundaryless grace of the one eternal God, then it gets an amen from me, for sure. And you know, Paul is writing the letter that Josh has just read to the same city that the funeral took place in yesterday, to Rome. There's this link in the history. And in Romans 14, he's describing, I believe, what type of church they're called to be, what type of church they could be. He's not talking about steeples and spires and architecture, but he's talking about setting ourselves apart by the grace of God. That grace should be the thing that sets us apart from the world. A church marked by grace is something that sounds amazing, but actually is less glamorous to build than it sounds. You can call your church Grace-Filled Baptist Church, or you can call it Grace Imoc, Grace Face, Grace Church, if you really want to. But if you want to get to that place of grace, you've got to go through some stuff together. We were talking about train stations last week, which I know many of you loved. But if grace was a train station, the stops to pass through are, well, firstly, forgiveness. Sometimes we've got to go through misunderstanding to get to that place of reconciliation. Sometimes we've got to have difficult conversations. Sometimes we've got to stop at humility for a while and learn humility if we're going to get to that place of grace as a church. Now, these places are a lot less glamorous than the final destination, but there is no lived out grace without them. The journey towards grace can be messy. And a lot of what Paul was writing about in the New Testament isn't about building this sort of picture-perfect church, but it is about building churches that are shaped by the grace of God. You know, that's what will sustain us in the long term, is if we're shaped by God's grace. Not if we're focused on how we seem to the world, but actually allowing God's Spirit to do the hard work among us. And that's exactly what's going on here as Paul writes about the weak and the strong. The weak and the strong. Beginning of the chapter. Except the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. Now, this could be a difficult passage to get our heads around. What does Paul actually mean when he talks about the weak and the strong. In our culture, we've got pretty set ideas about what is weak and what is strong. Strong to a lot of us means winning, and weak means, well, you fill out the next bit. Weak means losing. Strong means having a lot, and weak, therefore, means not having much. Strong means that you've got a loud voice and that people can hear you, and weak often means in our culture that nobody listens to what you have to say. Strong means that you have something to contribute, something that you bring. Weak means that you just accept what's ever handed to you. That's a little bit about what the world has to say about strong and weak. But to read this passage well, I think we need to be ready for God to prod at some of these assumptions. Because in God's kingdom, in God's economy, weakness and strength look quite a little bit different. And there's a story behind this letter that sets the context, and that story is told in the book, well, the letter to Galatians and the book of Acts, and it's about Peter and Paul. And Peter had been going around saying to people, hey guys, great to have you around, but could you just watch what you eat, because there's some guys who used to be Jewish and they're now walking as Christians, but we don't want to upset them too much, and so could we just be a bit more careful? And the Apostle Paul got out his pen. Okay, and when Paul gets out his pen, you know that you're in trouble, okay? And he started writing some pretty fearsome, quite angry letters to Peter saying, "Ho, can you just not do that? There's a lot going on here. There's a lot at stake here. And actually, it's for freedom that Christ has set us free, okay? So all food is on the table. We don't have to worry about what we eat, what we don't eat. We don't have to observe the same religious festivals that they used to. Actually, Jesus has died to set us free from all of that. So, Peter, you've got to watch yourself. You've got to make sure that you're not bringing people back into this kind of religiosity where it's all about not stepping on the wrong part of the pavement. You need to propel people into freedom and not instead burden them with all of these laws and traditions." Okay, so that's a bit of the context. Years later, Paul hasn't changed his position on any of that by any means, but from before, but he does have a slightly different posture. He's writing this letter to the church in Rome, which was a pretty diverse mixture of people, and in particular, he's writing to both Jews and to Gentiles, people from both sides of the track, who are, of course, both Christians now. And he's saying this: if you get God's grace, amazing. But be patient, please be patient with those who are still learning. And so when Paul talks about the weak, it might be easy to think he's talking about someone who's new to faith. It might be easy to think he's talking about somebody who's maybe struggling externally or life's hard for them. But he's not, actually. When he talks about the weak, he's referring to those who are addicted to having a rules-based religion, who need crutches to kind of make sense of everything all of the time, whether they're Jew or Gentile. And you know, we could have been going to church for 50 years. You could be a pastor. And according to Paul, you could be weak in your faith because you still have this rules-based religious view of what it looks like to be a Christian. The strong, on the other hand, are those who have learned to thrive in grace. It's a good question to ask yourself this morning. Have I really learned how to thrive in God's grace? If yes, amazing. The strong were all about freedom. They heard the news about Jesus. They said, woohoo, this is amazing. I believe it. Let's live it out. When Paul said that all food was on the table, not literally, figuratively, they believed him. They didn't have any qualms with that. When Paul said that you are free to do whatever you want as long as you look to honor God in all of it, they took him at his word and they thrived. You know, we could have been promoted 100 times in our workplace. We can be distinguished in whatever career path or expertise we have. You could have endless amounts of letters after your name, and you can be weak in the context of God's grace. What counts out there doesn't necessarily carry the same weight in here or in here. That makes sense? God's exchange rate is different. And you know, from God's perspective, the most important thing is your receptivity to grace. The most important thing about you is how receptive you are to his grace. Is it going to transform you? Is it going to open your eyes to see the world and those around you differently? Jesus is grace. You know, it says in John 1 that he came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. Come on, wake up. Wake up, everyone. I'm going to try that one more time. Full of grace and truth. So the more we know Jesus, the more our weaknesses, our crutches fade to the back, because we don't need them anymore to get close to God. And instead, our strength becomes him. Some of you know that verse. Christ in me is the hope of glory. No, not my adhering to a bunch of laws or rules or doing it the way that somebody told me to do it exactly to the letter. But Christ in me is my only hope. He is my grace. He is my truth. So modern day, weak and strong, looks a bit different, I'm sure, but fundamentally it's the same thing. One person might say, well, this is the way faith has really worked for me, and so therefore, this is the way it must be for you. It's weak. That's the weak way of doing faith. It's not to say that we can't disciple one another. Of course we can. But what I'm talking about is when we're led by observance to a procedure, when that becomes the main thing, instead of being led by the Spirit, what we do is we place burdens on one another instead of passing a gift to one another. You know, it's difficult to describe, but if I'm passing Jordan a gift, and he will gratefully receive it and take it and run with it and do something nice for it. If I'm passing Jordan a burden, what are you going to do with it, Jordan? You're going to struggle. You're going to want to get shot of that as quickly as you can. And the weak have a tendency to elevate things that aren't that important into things that are essential. And they take particular ideas that maybe worked for some people at a certain time, and they're great things, and they turn them into these monuments that must be observed by everyone always. A weak faith tries to control everything around it, and eventually it becomes unhealthy. A strong faith, wherever it looks like, is Jesus-centered, is Spirit-led, and isn't fixated on the stuff round the edges. Of course, there are disputable matters. Of course, we've got to talk about these things. Of course, we've got to have difficult conversations and work out what the right thing to do is. But a strong faith gets that faith is a living relationship with God. A living relationship with God. I've had to be strong in grace this week. On Tuesday, it was my dad's birthday. And this is the photo my mum put up on Facebook. Ouch. The whole family, except for me. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. She said, "Happy birthday to my darling Tim," from me and the rest of the family. I mean, fair enough, leave me out, but my kids? You leave my kids out of the family photo? And my wife? Exactly, Abina. So I said, "Lord, help me be strong in grace." I said, "Dona nobis pacem," which is a joke in Latin, like beginning of the sermon. Anyway, I had to be strong in grace. Paul gives a resounding message to those feeling strong. Oh yeah, Haley, you can just show the comment that I left. She never even replied. Paul gives a resounding message to those feeling strong. Get off the weak's back. Don't stop teaching them about grace. Don't stop showing them the path of grace, but stop judging them. Stop judging them. Do those who are strong in the grace of God get to lord it over those who don't quite get it yet? Do they? Do they get to lord it over them? No. By no means. I think Paul would say, by no means. Of course not. To do that, to judge them, to lord it over them, would actually be to show that they're weak, that they don't really get it at all. And if you think about it, snakes and ladders wise, you're just sent back right to the bottom the moment that you start judging others. Those who are strong in the grace of God must not judge those who are not. And this is the beautiful faith that we are called to live out together. I love it. I love it. God calls each one of us higher because he loves us and he wants us to be transformed into Jesus-like people. You could look at it and say, oh, God doesn't let us off the hook. Yeah, kind of. But also he calls us higher because if we live like this, the world will take notice. And it's not even about that, but God will be glorified when we live like this. Those who are strong, we don't get to play judge, but instead we are asked to put out of our lives anything that would cause somebody to stumble. Paul writes, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or a sister. I mean, you might think, well, it's not my problem. If they have an issue with what I'm doing, it's not my problem. I'm just doing what I'm doing, and I'm free, and it's for freedom that Christ has set us free, so I'm going to do whatever I need to do, and if somebody has an issue with it, then that's their problem. And Paul would say, it's your problem. It is your problem. If love is your motivation, it's your problem too now. So you've got to figure out what to do next. If what you drink, or what you smoke, or your language, or what you wear, or your decision, the decisions that you make causes them to stumble in some way, it's incumbent on those strong in the grace of God to figure it out and not just on the weak. That's the kindness of God that's worked out in his body throughout the church. This is some of the hard stuff that we're called to. Of course, there are nuances involved. There are different things, different challenges. But I wonder if we need to just come back to this passage every now and again at Stenhouse and hold ourselves up to it as a mirror and say, does our church look like this? Does our church look like a place where those who are strong in the grace of God are kind and gentle and gracious with those who are still learning about what it means to be fully living in the river of God's grace? I think the clearest teaching of the weak and the strong that Jesus gave was in this prodigal son story. And I'm going to assume, looking out in front of me, that most of us have heard it. So I'm not going to tell the whole story again. Not today. But there are two brothers in the story. And I want to ask, by the end of the story, who was strong and who was weak? Was that Aaron? The younger was strong and the elder brother was weak. So the one who had squandered his father's wealth was strong now in the grace of God because of the encounter that he'd had with his father. And the one who thought he knew it all and had worked very, very hard, to be fair, was now weak. And I wonder if Paul had written this letter, to that father's house, and the postman had delivered it, all the way down that long drive. And I wonder if the father ran out every time the postman came. Probably not. And if he'd written a letter addressed to the younger son, I think it would sound a little bit like this. He'd say, "Dear younger / prodigal son, please don't get caught up in squabbles about things that don't really matter with your big brother. What a waste of energy that would be. Try not to judge him too much, but instead, try to continuously, relentlessly show him the grace that has transformed you. If there's stuff that is triggering him, put it out of your life. Can it be so important to you that you're happy to cause him to suffer? Yours, Paul. And I've not just come up with that. That's basically word for word. Romans 14. Verse 19, Paul says, "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification." Paul's big idea here is us learning God's hospitality. Learning God's hospitality. And I'm not talking about working 14 hours at a wedding, okay? I'm also not talking about having people over to your house, which is great. Keep doing that. But I'm talking about the idea of hospitality that is making space for people who are different to you in your life and in your heart. Making space for people who are different to you in your life. That's God's hospitality. And I was thinking, this should be a central text, a central bit of the Bible for us to use as a church. And then I thought, maybe anyone who's new to our church should be physically forced to memorize this whole passage in Romans 14. And then I thought, oh my goodness, is that what a weak person would say? Am I a weak person? If we want grace to abound, we've got to practice hospitality. And we need space for these relationships to form, to take place. The opposite of this type of grace-filled, hospitable church is a church that sits in judgment of one another the whole time. That's the opposite. And that's clearly something going on in Rome back then. And Paul says, therefore, let's stop passing judgment on one another. What a waste of time. In what way does that look any different from what the world does? The other opposite that you have is a church that maybe moves away from diversity. Remember, Rome was a very diverse church. You can have a church that moves away from diversity because it's too hard, because it's exhausting, because it's easier just to practice faith with people who look like us, sound like us, dress like us, smell like us, whatever. But let's not do that. Our difference is part of our message and the light that we carry to the world that says what we have in common is what ultimately shines through us, and that is the grace of God. That's what brings us together. That's what unites us. That's all we have in common, really. Churches are places where the careers advisor can learn from someone who's never worked about the grace of God. Where a teenager can show somebody in their 60s something about the Father's love, and it can be received without pretense, with full humility. I love that whatever position God finds us in, he calls us deeper. So whatever position you're in today, whether you think, I'm definitely weak, I'm definitely strong, or whether, like me, you probably think that you're weak in some areas and you're strong in others, he wants us to grow. He wants all of us to grow. He wants us as a church to grow. So perhaps a better question than, am I weak or am I strong? A better question would be to ask is, am I patient with those around me? Am I Christ-like with those around me? Do I practice grace with them? There's a little quote from Pope Francis about God's love. He said, "Let me say this once more. God never tires of forgiving us. We are the ones who tire of seeking his mercy, time and time again, he bears us on his shoulders with his boundless and unfailing love. The strong ones aren't addicted to rule keeping. The strong ones actually are addicted to the love of a God who never tires of forgiving. Addicted to grace. But the encouragement that I want to finish with is that this sort of church that Paul's describing, this sort of believer, doesn't happen by accident. We don't just fall into this stuff without trying. Especially in a culture where we want things instantly, we run away from awkwardness, we get frustrated easily. Why don't they just get it yet? They've been around for ages. Why can't they just get the grace of God? This doesn't just happen by accident, so let's not be put off, because the prize here is to become more and more like Jesus. When you set your heart, whether you feel weak or strong, when you set your heart to this, that's what happens, is that we are conformed to the image of the Son of God. And that's what I want for my life, and that's what I'm praying for each one of us here. And I pray that the legacy of our lives might be building bridges towards the wide-reaching mercy that we have found in Jesus Christ. Let's pray.